I heard my daughter-in-law whisper, "Now I'll finally be free," just 10 feet away from my son's casket. I didn't turn around. I didn't gasp. I didn't even blink. I just stood there, my gloved hands folded neatly in front of me, staring at the polished wood that held what was left of my only child. And in that moment, something inside me shifted so quietly no one else could have noticed. The church was filled with the soft murmur of condolences and the faint scent of white lilies, the kind Daniel used to say smelled too sweet for his taste. But Vanessa had chosen them anyway. Of course she had, because everything about this day had been arranged to look perfect, to look appropriate, to look like grief. I could hear her voice again, just behind me, low but not low enough, speaking to a cluster of women dressed in black who leaned in as if they were sharing something intimate, something sacred. But there was nothing sacred in the way she said it, nothing trembling or broken, just a smooth, almost relieved tone that didn't belong in a room like this. "It's been so hard," she added, and I could almost picture the expression she must have been wearing, the slight tilt of her head, the careful press of her lips, the performance she had perfected over the years. I had seen that expression before, at family dinners, at holidays, at moments when she needed sympathy or control, and for a long time, I had convinced myself it was just her way, just a difference in personality, just something I needed to accept for Daniel's sake. The pastor's voice echoed softly from the front of the room, speaking about love and memory and the kind of man my son had been, steady, kind, dependable, the kind of man who would give everything for the people he loved. And I felt my throat tighten, not from tears, but from the weight of how little that had mattered in the end. I kept my eyes fixed ahead, but my ears were wide open now, catching every word, every inflection, every pause behind me, because once you hear something like that, you don't unhear it, you don't brush it aside, you don't pretend it didn't happen. You listen, you remember, you start to notice things you ignored before. A soft laugh slipped from Vanessa's lips, quickly covered, but not quickly enough, and one of her friends murmured something I couldn't quite make out, followed by a quiet, knowing chuckle, the kind people share when they think no one important is paying attention. I felt the air in the room change, or maybe it was just me. Maybe it was the moment grief stopped being the only thing I felt, and something colder, sharper began to take its place, something that didn't rush or explode but settled in slowly, like a decision forming without words. I thought about Daniel as a boy, the way he used to run into the house after school, dropping his backpack by the door, calling out for me before I even had a chance to greet him, and how that same boy had grown into a man who, over the past few years, had become quieter, more distant, his phone always face down, his visits shorter, his explanations thinner. At the time, I told myself it was work, it was stress, it was life pulling him in different directions, but standing there, listening to the woman he married speak, as if his absence had lifted a burden, I felt those memories rearrange themselves into something I could no longer ignore. The organ began to play softly, signaling the next part of the service, and people shifted in their seats, tissues rustling, shoes scuffing lightly against the floor, but I remained still, composed, exactly as I had been taught to be, exactly as I had always been, because there is a certain kind of strength in not reacting, in allowing the moment to unfold without giving anyone the satisfaction of seeing you break. I lowered my gaze slightly, just enough to see the edge of the casket, the reflection of the overhead lights gliding across its surface, and I let out a slow, measured breath. I would grieve my son. That was not a question. But as for the woman standing behind me, the one who believed this day marked her freedom, I realized with a quiet certainty that she had misunderstood something very important, because freedom, real freedom, doesn't begin with a whisper at a funeral, and whatever she thought she had gained in that moment, she had no idea what it was about to cost her. The service moved forward in a blur of quiet rituals and practiced sorrow, and I followed each step as if I had done it 1,000 times before, even though every movement felt heavier than it should have, as if the air itself had thickened around me. People approached one by one, offering condolences in soft voices, their hands warm against mine, their eyes filled with genuine sympathy, and I nodded politely, thanking them, accepting their words with a calm that surprised even me. I had always believed grief would be loud, overwhelming, something that would break through every attempt at composure. But what I felt instead was controlled, contained, almost distant, as if my heart had stepped back to make room for something else that needed my attention. Vanessa stood near the front, greeting guests with a careful balance of fragility and grace, her hand occasionally lifting to her chest, as if steadying herself, her voice catching at just the right moments, and anyone watching from the outside would have seen a devoted wife shattered by loss. I watched her the way one watches a performance they have already seen before, noticing the timing, the repetition, the subtle adjustments she made depending on who was standing in front of her. When an older couple approached, she leaned into them, allowing her shoulders to slump slightly, her expression softening into something vulnerable. When Daniel's colleagues came forward, she straightened just a bit, her voice gaining strength, her words more composed, as if she were already stepping into a different role, one that required stability and control. It was precise, intentional, and once I saw it clearly, I could not unsee it. I moved slowly through the room, pausing near the photographs arranged along the side table, images of Daniel at different stages of his life, his first day of school, his college graduation, his wedding day, each moment captured in a frame that now felt like a version of him I could reach but never touch again. In one photo, he stood beside Vanessa, his arm around her shoulders, smiling in a way that had once reassured me, a smile that said he was happy, that he had chosen well, and I realized how much I had relied on that image, how much I had trusted what I thought I saw. A man from Daniel's office stepped beside me and spoke quietly about how dependable my son had been, how he had stayed late to help others, how he had never complained, and I thanked him, my voice steady, even as a small, quiet question formed beneath the surface of my thoughts, one I had not allowed myself to ask before. Dependable for whom? Giving to whom? I glanced toward Vanessa again and saw her speaking with the funeral director, her tone low but firm, her gestures controlled, as if she were discussing logistics rather than loss. And something about that moment settled deeper into me, not as anger, not as accusation, but as recognition. After the final prayer, people began to gather their coats, the room slowly shifting from ceremony to departure, and Vanessa moved through the crowd with renewed energy, thanking people for coming, accepting embraces, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without ever sounding strained. As she passed near me, she placed a light hand on my arm and said, "We will get through this," her eyes meeting mine for a brief second, and in that second, I saw nothing of the whisper I had heard earlier, nothing of the quiet laughter, only a polished, careful expression that revealed exactly what she wanted it to reveal and nothing more. I nodded once, not trusting myself to say anything that would not give away what had already begun to take shape inside me. Outside, the afternoon air was cool, a soft breeze moving through the rows of parked cars, and people lingered in small groups, speaking in low tones, reluctant to leave but unsure of what else to do. I stood at the edge of the steps, watching as Vanessa moved among them, accepting sympathy, offering gratitude, her posture straight, her movements deliberate, and I realized that whatever had just ended for me inside that church, something else had quietly begun, something that required patience, attention, and above all, silence. Because there are moments in life when the truth does not need to be announced. It only needs to be understood, and once it is understood, everything that follows becomes a matter of time. The ride back to the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that does not need to be filled, and I sat in the passenger seat staring out the window as the familiar streets passed by, each one carrying a memory that now felt slightly out of place, as if I were seeing everything through a layer that had not been there before. Vanessa drove with steady hands, her posture composed, her eyes focused on the road, and if someone had looked at her from the outside, they would have seen a woman holding herself together, a woman doing what needed to be done after a loss like this. She did not speak much, only a few soft remarks about how many people had come, how beautiful the service had been, how Daniel would have appreciated it, and I nodded when it seemed appropriate, offering small acknowledgments without inviting anything deeper. I watched the way her fingers tapped lightly against the steering wheel when she thought I was not looking, a subtle, restless motion that did not match the calm tone of her voice, and I stored that detail away without reacting to it. When we pulled into the driveway, the house stood exactly as it always had, neat, orderly, unchanged on the outside. But the moment I stepped inside, I felt the absence immediately, not as a sharp pain, but as a hollow space that had already begun to settle into the walls. Vanessa moved ahead of me, placing her purse carefully on the entry table, slipping off her shoes with a quiet efficiency, and for a brief moment, she paused, as if considering something, before turning toward me with a small, measured expression. "You should get some rest," she said gently, her voice softened in a way that might have sounded caring to anyone else, and I gave a slight nod, thanking her, even as I noticed how quickly she looked away once the words were spoken. I walked toward the living room, my steps slow but steady, and lowered myself into the chair by the window, the same chair where I had sat countless times before, watching Daniel as he came and went, always knowing the sound of his car, always anticipating the moment he would walk through the door. The room was quiet now, but not empty, because the traces of him were still there, in the books he had left behind, in the framed photographs, in the small, ordinary details that most people would overlook. From the kitchen, I could hear Vanessa moving around, the soft clink of glass, the opening and closing of cabinets, and then, after a few minutes, her voice again, lower this time, speaking into her phone. I did not move, did not lean closer, did not try to make it obvious that I was listening, but the house carried sound in a way that made privacy difficult, and certain words reached me whether I intended to hear them or not. "It is done," she said, her tone different now, lighter, less restrained, and there was a pause, followed by a quiet laugh that she did not bother to hide this time. I kept my gaze on the window, watching the faint movement of branches outside, as if that were where my attention belonged, even as every part of me sharpened, focused, absorbed what was being said without letting it show. "No, she does not suspect anything," Vanessa continued, and the calm certainty in her voice settled into me more heavily than anything I had heard earlier that day. There was another pause, longer this time, and then, more softly, "I just need a little time, and everything will be in my name." The words did not shock me the way they might have a few hours earlier, because something in me had already adjusted, already begun to expect that what I was hearing would not align with what I was being shown. I remained still, my hands resting lightly in my lap, my breathing even, my expression unchanged, because there is a moment when reacting too soon gives away more than it protects, and I had no intention of giving anything away. Vanessa ended the call shortly after, her footsteps moving back toward the hallway, and when she appeared in the doorway, she looked exactly as she had before, composed, appropriate, her expression carefully arranged into something that suggested concern and shared loss. "I made some tea," she said, holding out a cup as she stepped closer, and I accepted it with a small, polite smile, thanking her once again, meeting her gaze just long enough to acknowledge the gesture without revealing the quiet shift that had taken place beneath the surface. As I lifted the cup, feeling the warmth against my hands, I realized that whatever this situation truly was, it was no longer something I would question or dismiss, because the pieces were no longer scattered, they were beginning to form a pattern, and once a pattern begins to appear, it does not disappear, it only becomes clearer with time. And I had all the time I needed. That night, after the house had settled into a quiet that felt almost deliberate, I remained awake long after the lights were turned off, sitting at the small desk in the corner of the guest room where I had been staying, my hands folded neatly in front of me as I allowed the memories I had kept carefully organized for years to surface one by one, no longer dismissing them, no longer softening their edges to make them easier to accept. It is a strange thing, how the mind protects itself by rearranging the past into something gentler, something more forgiving. But once that protection begins to fade, the truth does not arrive all at once. It unfolds slowly, each moment revealing itself with a clarity that feels both precise and undeniable. I thought about the first time I noticed a change in Daniel, how he had begun to cancel our Sunday dinners more often, always with a reasonable explanation, always with that same apologetic tone that made it difficult to question him, and how Vanessa would sometimes speak on his behalf, her voice smooth, her words carefully chosen, as if she were helping him manage his time, helping him prioritize what mattered most. At the time, I had told myself that this was what marriage looked like, that adjustments were natural, that boundaries shifted as lives became more complex, and I accepted it because I believed in giving space, in trusting the people I loved to make their own choices. But sitting there in the dim light, I remembered smaller things, details that had once seemed insignificant but now carried a different weight. The way Daniel had hesitated before answering certain questions, the way he would glance toward Vanessa as if checking something unspoken, the way conversations would change direction the moment she entered the room. There had been a dinner, nearly a year ago, when he had mentioned something about updating paperwork, something about organizing accounts, and Vanessa had quickly stepped in, laughing lightly, saying she would take care of it, that it was already being handled, and I had not thought to question it further because there had been no reason to, or at least that is what I believed then. I remembered how she had gradually taken over more of the household decisions, how she spoke with a confidence that made it seem natural, inevitable even, and how Daniel had grown quieter in those moments, allowing her to lead conversations that once would have been his. None of it had been dramatic, none of it had felt urgent, and that was precisely why it had gone unnoticed, because it did not arrive as conflict. It arrived as convenience, as efficiency, as something that appeared helpful on the surface. I leaned back slightly in the chair, my gaze drifting to the closed door, aware of the silence on the other side, aware that Vanessa was somewhere down the hall, likely resting, likely preparing for the days ahead in ways I could only begin to understand now. There had also been the matter of the documents Daniel had once mentioned in passing, something about reviewing them together, something he had intended to show me but never did, and at the time, I had not pressed him, thinking there would be another opportunity, another conversation, another moment when everything could be clarified without urgency. But now, that unfinished conversation lingered in my mind with a quiet persistence, no longer a loose thread, but something more deliberate, something that suggested intention rather than oversight. I stood slowly, moving toward the small dresser by the wall, opening the top drawer where I had placed my belongings earlier that day, and I took out the notebook I carried with me, the one where I occasionally wrote things down, reminders, thoughts, small details I did not want to forget. I opened it carefully, turning to a blank page, and for a moment, I simply held the pen without writing, allowing the silence to settle around me once more, because there is a difference between reacting and preparing, and I had no intention of confusing the two. When I finally began to write, my movements were steady, deliberate, noting dates, recalling conversations, piecing together fragments that had once seemed unrelated but now aligned with a clarity that left little room for doubt. I did not rush, did not force conclusions. I simply recorded what I knew, what I had seen, what I had heard, because the truth does not need to be exaggerated to be powerful, it only needs to be understood in full. As I closed the notebook and placed it back in the drawer, I felt a quiet certainty settle into place, not driven by anger or grief, but by something far more stable, a sense of direction that had been missing before. Whatever Vanessa believed she had secured, whatever plans she had set in motion, she had made one critical mistake. She had assumed that I would remain exactly as I had always been, that I would continue to accept, to trust, to overlook, and in doing so, she had overlooked something herself, something she would come to understand in time, because patience is not weakness, and silence is not surrender. And when both are used with intention, they become something far more powerful than either. Alone. The next morning arrived with a stillness that felt almost rehearsed, as if the house itself was waiting to see what I would do next, and I moved through it slowly, deliberately, allowing every detail to settle into place before I acted on anything. Vanessa was already awake when I stepped into the kitchen, dressed neatly, her hair pulled back, a cup of coffee in her hand as she scrolled through something on her phone, and when she looked up, her expression shifted instantly into something warm, something appropriate, something that would have reassured anyone who did not know what I now knew. "I was just about to check on you," she said softly, setting her phone aside, her tone carefully measured, and I gave her a small nod, thanking her, matching her calm with my own, because there was no advantage in revealing even the slightest change in me. She spoke about arrangements that still needed to be handled, about paperwork, about calls that had to be made, her words organized, efficient, as if she had already moved beyond the weight of the previous day and into something more practical, and I listened without interrupting, noting not just what she said, but how she said it, the ease in her voice, the absence of hesitation. "There are a few documents we should go over later," she added, her eyes meeting mine briefly, and I noticed the way she held that gaze just a fraction longer than necessary, as if measuring my response, as if confirming something for herself. "Of course," I replied, my voice steady, giving her exactly what she expected to hear. Nothing more, nothing less. After breakfast, she stepped out onto the back patio to take a call, and I remained inside, clearing the table slowly, giving myself time to think, to organize what I had already begun to piece together. The house felt different in daylight, not lighter, but clearer, as if the shadows of the previous day had been replaced with something sharper, more defined, and I moved toward Daniel's study without hesitation, my steps quiet but certain. The door was slightly ajar, and when I pushed it open, the room greeted me with the familiar scent of paper and wood, the same orderly space he had always maintained, everything in its place, everything reflecting the man he had been. I walked to the desk, running my fingers lightly along its surface, pausing at the small stack of folders arranged neatly in the corner, and I knew, without needing to open them immediately, that this was where I would find the answers I had been missing. I sat down slowly, pulling the top folder toward me, and began to go through its contents with careful attention, not rushing, not skipping ahead, because details matter, especially when someone has taken great care to arrange things in a way that appears ordinary. Statements, copies of correspondence, notes written in Daniel's precise handwriting, each page adding a layer to something that was beginning to take shape in a way that left little room for doubt. There were transfers I did not recognize, accounts that had been adjusted, signatures that seemed out of place, not incorrect, but not entirely right either, and I felt that same quiet certainty deepen, not as a reaction, but as an understanding. Outside, I could still hear Vanessa's voice, faint but present, her tone confident, assured, as if she believed everything was proceeding exactly as planned, and I allowed that belief to remain untouched, because sometimes the most effective way to understand a situation fully is to let it continue without interruption. I closed the folder gently, returning it to its place exactly as I had found it, making sure nothing appeared disturbed, nothing suggested that I had been there at all, and I stood, taking one last look around the room before stepping back into the hallway. When Vanessa came back inside a few minutes later, she found me exactly where she would have expected, seated quietly in the living room, my hands folded, my expression composed, and she smiled, that same practiced, reassuring smile, unaware that while she had been speaking freely outside, I had been listening in a different way, not to her words, but to the pattern she had already set in motion. As she began to speak again about timelines and arrangements, I realized that whatever she thought she was preparing for, whatever outcome she believed was already secured, she had built it on the assumption that no one was paying attention, and that assumption, more than anything else, was where her certainty would begin to unravel. Later that afternoon, the house settled into a quiet rhythm that would have felt ordinary to anyone else. But to me, every sound carried weight, every movement had meaning, and I allowed myself to move within that space carefully, never rushing, never forcing anything out of place. Vanessa had positioned herself at the dining table with her laptop open, papers spread neatly in front of her, her posture straight, her expression focused in a way that suggested responsibility, control, and quiet authority, and when she glanced up at me, she offered a small, reassuring smile as if everything unfolding was simply part of a necessary process. "I spoke with the attorney this morning," she said, her tone calm, almost casual, and I took a seat across from her, folding my hands lightly in my lap, giving her my full attention without revealing how closely I was listening. "There are just a few formalities left," she continued, sliding a document slightly closer to her side of the table, not quite offering it, not quite withholding it, a subtle gesture that did not go unnoticed. I nodded slowly, allowing a moment of silence to pass before responding, because silence often reveals more than questions ever could. "Daniel mentioned once that he wanted everything to be clear," I said evenly, choosing my words with care, watching the smallest shift in her expression, the brief pause before she responded. "Yes, he did," she replied quickly, her voice steady but just a touch too precise, as if she had rehearsed that answer before it was ever needed. "And that is exactly what I am making sure of." I let that settle between us, not challenging it, not agreeing with it, simply allowing it to exist, because truth does not need to be argued when it is already present beneath the surface. She began to explain details, accounts, timelines, procedures, her words structured in a way that sounded official, complete, but as she spoke, I noticed the small inconsistencies, the moments where her explanation moved too quickly over certain points, the places where details were implied rather than clearly stated. The primary accounts will be consolidated, she said, her fingers tapping lightly against the edge of the paper, and the remaining assets will be handled accordingly. The phrasing was careful, almost distant, as if she were describing something that no longer required emotion, only execution, and I listened without interruption, allowing her to continue, to build her explanation in full. Of course, everything is already in motion, she added, glancing at me briefly, and I gave a slight nod, meeting her gaze just long enough to acknowledge her words without confirming them. That is good, I said quietly, my voice even, because agreement, when given at the right moment, can be more revealing than resistance. There was a pause then, brief but noticeable, and she leaned back slightly in her chair, studying me in a way that suggested she was expecting something more, a question, a concern, a reaction that would confirm her understanding of the situation. When none came, she smiled again, softer this time, as if reassured by my composure, as if my silence had confirmed exactly what she needed it to confirm. I know this is a lot, she said gently, her tone shifting once more into something that resembled care, but I will make sure everything is taken care of. I inclined my head slightly, accepting her words without hesitation, because sometimes the most effective way to understand a plan is to allow the person who created it to believe it is working exactly as intended. After a moment, she gathered the papers into a neat stack, closing her laptop with a quiet click, her movements efficient, controlled, and she stood, smoothing her blouse as she did so. I have a few more calls to make, she said, already turning toward the hallway, and I watched her go, noting the confidence in her steps, the absence of doubt in her posture. When she disappeared from view, I remained seated for a few seconds longer, my gaze resting on the place where the documents had been, and then I stood slowly, moving to the table, my fingers brushing lightly against the surface as if nothing had changed, as if I were simply passing through. But nothing was unchanged, not anymore, because what she had shown me was not just information, it was intention, carefully arranged, deliberately presented, and now that I had seen it clearly, there was no need to question what came next, only to decide when and how it would unfold. The following morning unfolded with a quiet precision that felt almost deliberate, as if every moment had already been arranged before I stepped into it, and I allowed myself to follow its rhythm without resistance, moving through the house with the same calm I had maintained since the day before, knowing that consistency would be my greatest advantage. Vanessa was already on the phone when I entered the kitchen, her voice low but confident, the kind of tone that suggested familiarity rather than uncertainty, and she did not notice me at first, which gave me just enough time to observe without being observed. Yes, that is exactly what we discussed, she said, her words measured, each one placed carefully, and I moved quietly toward the counter, pouring myself a glass of water as if that had been my only intention. No, she will not question it, Vanessa continued, and there was a pause, followed by a soft, almost amused exhale, the kind that reveals more than the words themselves. I did not look at her, did not shift my posture, did not give any indication that I had heard what I was not meant to hear, because there is a certain power in remaining unnoticed when others believe they are in control. She ended the call moments later and turned toward me with that same composed expression, as if the conversation had never taken place, as if nothing had been said that required explanation. "You are up early," she remarked lightly, and I nodded, offering a simple response that matched her tone without inviting further discussion. "I have always been an early riser," I said, my voice steady, and she smiled, accepting that answer without question, because it fit the version of me she believed she understood. After breakfast, she mentioned that we would need to visit the attorney's office later that week to finalize everything, her words smooth, confident, as if the outcome was already decided, and I agreed without hesitation, because agreement, in this case, allowed her to continue exactly as she intended. The rest of the morning passed in quiet activity, small tasks that gave the appearance of normalcy. But beneath that surface, I remained focused, attentive, allowing each detail to settle into place before I acted on anything. When Vanessa stepped out again to take another call, I returned to the study, this time with a clearer purpose, moving directly to the lower drawer of Daniel's desk, where I had noticed a set of documents the day before that had not yet been examined. The drawer opened smoothly, revealing neatly organized files, each one labeled in Daniel's handwriting, and I selected one at random, not because it was random, but because sometimes the truth reveals itself more clearly when approached without forcing a specific direction. Inside, I found copies of statements, correspondence with financial institutions, and something else, something that held my attention longer than the rest, a letter addressed to an attorney whose name I did not recognize, dated just a few months before Daniel passed. I read it carefully, my eyes moving steadily across the page, taking in each word without rushing, and as I did, I felt that same quiet certainty deepen, not as a reaction, but as confirmation. Daniel had been aware, not of everything perhaps, but enough to take steps, enough to question, enough to ensure that what he had built would not be handled carelessly. There were instructions outlined in careful detail, references to documents that were not part of the main file, and a tone that suggested caution rather than trust, and I closed the folder gently, returning it to its place exactly as I had found it, because the most important thing now was not what I knew, but how I chose to use it. When I stepped back into the hallway, Vanessa's voice echoed faintly from outside, still engaged in another conversation, still moving forward with the same confidence she had shown from the beginning, and I allowed that to continue, because sometimes the most effective way to understand the full scope of a situation is to let it unfold without interference. By the time she returned inside, I was once again seated in the living room, exactly where she would expect me to be, my hands resting calmly, my expression unchanged, and she paused briefly, as if assessing something, before offering a small, satisfied smile. "Everything is coming together," she said, her tone light, assured, and I met her gaze with the same quiet composure I had maintained all along, because what she saw in that moment was exactly what she expected to see, and that, more than anything else, was what would allow me to see everything she had yet to reveal. The day of the meeting arrived with a clarity that felt almost deliberate, the kind of morning where everything appears calm on the surface, while something far more significant waits just beneath it, and I prepared myself without urgency, choosing a simple outfit, moving through each step with the same steady rhythm I had maintained since the beginning, because consistency, I had learned, allows others to remain comfortable in their assumptions. Vanessa seemed particularly composed that morning, her movements precise, her tone light as she spoke about the schedule, about how the attorney would walk us through everything, about how this would bring a sense of closure, and I listened without interruption, offering small acknowledgments where appropriate, allowing her confidence to remain intact. The drive to the office was quiet, but not tense, and she filled the silence with practical details, timelines, next steps, all delivered in a way that suggested everything had already been decided, and I let her speak, because the more she revealed, the clearer the pattern became. The building itself was modest, professional, the kind of place where decisions are made quietly, but carry lasting consequences. And when we stepped inside, we were greeted by a receptionist who led us to a conference room where everything had already been arranged, folders neatly placed on the table, a pitcher of water set beside 2 glasses, the environment controlled, orderly, predictable. Vanessa took her seat with ease, her posture relaxed, her expression composed, and she glanced at me briefly, as if confirming that everything was proceeding exactly as expected, and I met her gaze with the same calm I had shown her all along. A few moments later, the attorney entered, a man in his late 50s with a measured presence, and as he greeted us, I noticed the brief flicker of recognition in his eyes when he looked at me, something subtle but unmistakable, and I inclined my head slightly in acknowledgement without drawing attention to it. He began with formalities, reviewing documents, explaining procedures, his voice steady, neutral, and Vanessa followed along with quiet confidence, occasionally nodding, occasionally adding small confirmations, as if reinforcing the narrative she had already constructed. As outlined here, the attorney said, sliding a document forward, the distribution reflects the most recent directives, and Vanessa leaned in slightly, her focus sharp, her expectation clear. I allowed a moment to pass before speaking, my voice calm, even because timing, I had learned, matters as much as intention. I believe there may be an additional document, I said quietly, my tone measured, not confrontational, simply factual, and the room shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible but entirely present. Vanessa turned toward me, her expression unchanged but her eyes more attentive now, searching for something she had not anticipated, and the attorney paused, his gaze moving between us before settling on me with a quiet understanding. There is, he said carefully, his voice steady but carrying a different weight now, and he reached into his briefcase, retrieving a separate folder that had not been part of the original stack on the table. Vanessa's posture adjusted slightly, not dramatically, but enough to suggest that something had moved beyond her control, and she watched closely as the attorney opened the folder, his movements deliberate, unhurried. This document was submitted privately, he continued, with specific instructions regarding its timing, and I remained still, my hands resting calmly, my expression composed, because this was not a moment for reaction, it was a moment for clarity. He began to read, outlining provisions that had not been mentioned before, conditions that redirected certain assets, safeguards that had been carefully put in place, and as the details unfolded, I did not need to look at Vanessa to know that the certainty she had carried into the room was beginning to shift. I simply listened, each word confirming what I had already begun to understand, each line reinforcing the quiet truth that had been forming since the moment I chose not to react. Because sometimes the most powerful change does not come from confrontation. It comes from allowing the truth to reveal itself at exactly the right moment, when there is no longer any room left to deny it. The attorney's voice continued, steady and precise, each word placed with the kind of care that leaves no room for interpretation, and I listened without interruption, my attention fixed not on the reaction across from me, but on the quiet certainty unfolding in front of us. The document outlined a structure that had been carefully designed, one that ensured oversight, one that required conditions to be met before anything could be transferred fully, and most importantly, one that placed control not in the hands of assumption, but in the hands of verification. Vanessa remained still at first, her expression composed, her posture controlled, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, a narrowing of focus, a recalculation that began the moment the language moved beyond what she had expected. In the event of any discrepancy, the attorney read, or evidence of misrepresentation regarding financial handling, all primary assets are to be held in trust, with full authority granted to the appointed executor until such matters are resolved. He paused briefly, allowing the weight of that sentence to settle, and then continued, outlining further provisions that reinforced the same principle, safeguards layered upon safeguards, each one designed with intention. I folded my hands lightly in front of me, my posture unchanged, because this was not a moment that required reaction, it required presence, and I had learned that presence, when held steadily, reveals far more than any response ever could. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, her composure still intact, but no longer effortless. Her attention sharpened now, her earlier confidence replaced with something more measured. There must be some misunderstanding, she said, her voice calm, but carrying a tighter edge, and the attorney met her gaze without hesitation. There is no misunderstanding, he replied evenly, his tone neither confrontational nor accommodating, simply factual. These instructions were provided directly, with clear intent. The room fell quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that does not need to be filled because everything that matters has already been said. I allowed that silence to remain, because it served its purpose, it created space for truth to exist without interference, and in that space, the difference between expectation and reality becomes impossible to ignore. Vanessa's gaze shifted briefly toward me, searching, assessing, perhaps hoping to find something in my expression that would restore the balance she believed she had. But I offered her nothing beyond the same calm I had shown from the beginning, because there was no advantage in revealing what had already been understood. The attorney closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table with a quiet finality that did not need to be emphasized. We will proceed according to these directives, he said, his voice steady. and I inclined my head slightly, acknowledging what had already been set in motion long before this moment arrived. Vanessa sat back slowly, her posture adjusting once more, not collapsing, not reacting outwardly, but recalibrating in a way that revealed just enough to be seen if one knew where to look. The certainty she had carried into the room had not disappeared entirely, but it had been altered, reshaped into something less secure, less defined, and I recognized that shift not with satisfaction, but with clarity. When the meeting concluded, we stood, gathering our things in silence, the room returning to its orderly stillness as if nothing of consequence had occurred, but I knew better, because the most important changes rarely announce themselves loudly. They settle quietly, taking root beneath the surface where they cannot be undone. As we stepped outside, the afternoon light stretched across the pavement, steady and unchanged, and Vanessa paused for just a moment before moving forward, her expression composed once again, her movements controlled, but not quite as effortless as before. I walked beside her without speaking, my pace unhurried, my attention focused not on what had been lost or gained, but on what had been revealed, because in the end, it was never about confrontation, it was about understanding, and once understanding is complete, everything else follows in its own time, without force, without noise, and without the need for anything more than quiet certainty.